Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we've been talking about crucial conversations, and I want to talk about how when they go wrong, how do they go wrong? So let me go to the first slide. We're going to talk about silence and violence. When a conversation fails, sometimes it fails in terms of people going to silence. They back down, they cave in, they knuckle under. Other times, it fails because they go to violence. They get hostile, defensive, they explode in anger. Now, here's the tricky part. People don't slide from silence to violence. It's not a gradual process. Instead, when people go to silence, their problem doesn't get solved. And so, people have the concern, but they fail to speak up. And when they fail to speak up, the concerns fester, they turn ugly, and what happens is the person flips. So it's not gradual, it's a flip, right? Now, we were interested in studying how people flip from silence to violence, so we did a research study, and I want to explain the study to you, but first I have to ask a qualifying question. How many of you here have spent a significant proportion of your professional career behind bars in a state penitentiary? Hands? Anyone? Okay, a couple of you will have to sit this one out because we studied this with murderers. And I want to take you through the study. So we went into 23 different prisons, mostly in the state of California. Typical prison would have 1,000 inmates. And we'd go in and we'd say, we want to look at the rap sheets of all the different prisoners. Now, the rap sheets have the crimes that a person's been convicted of. How many different crimes do you think the average inmate in a state penitentiary has been convicted of? 5, 6, 8, 12? It turns out between 6 and 7, closer to 7 than to 6. Right? Fair number of crimes. Then we would ask to look at the rap sheets of people convicted of murder. How many different crimes do you think the average murderer has been convicted of? 1. The murder. And who have they killed? Someone they know, right? A spouse, a lover, a neighbor, their boss, right? I had one warden describe it to me this way. She said, "Why, they've killed a loved one." Kind of makes your skin crawl, doesn't it? Now, we were interested in what made the murderers different from the average inmate population. Now, right off the bat, you see they're pretty different. The average inmate, 6 to 7 felony convictions. The average murderer, just 1, the murder. So you see on the one hand, you've got inmates who are professional criminals. On the other hand, you've got these murderers who are rank amateurs. But they were different in a lot of other ways, too. If you were to meet an average inmate out on the street, walking down towards you, you would describe them as self-confident, assured, assertive, right? Willing to ask you for things, like your purse. Oh yeah. Whereas the murderers were described by their coworkers, their neighbors, their family as introverted, shy, kind of depressed, bullied. Get the picture? These are people who, when they get in a crucial conversation, when they have a gripe or a grievance, they go to silence. And it doesn't get solved. It festers. It turns ugly. And then they flip, right? And they explode in anger. And they kill a loved one, right? Your basic human tragedy. Now, one of the things we discovered is this doesn't get better behind bars. Prisons don't make very good finishing schools. Behind bars, the same pattern happened. The murderers were far more likely than the average inmates to be bullied, to have people steal their mail, steal their magazines. They had the least preferred bunk. So those of you who have never been in prison, it's that top one, right? People don't like that one. They were more likely to have people steal food right off their plates, right? And here's how they handled it. They went to silence. They held it inside. It festered. It turned ugly, and then they exploded in rage at the prisoners around them. And how do you think those prisoners around them handled it? They beat the stuffing out of them, right? And so see how this pattern works for the murderers? okay, they say nothing, they go to silence, it gets worse, they get frustrated, they get angry, they explode in anger and get beaten up, pounded into the ground, and so the next time they've got a grievance, they go right back to silence. And you get trapped in this cycle. Now, without claiming that you're all a bunch of murderers, I do want to suggest that during a crucial conversation, a lot of us fall into that same pattern. And what I want to say is, it's not our fault. It's a design flaw. Right? So I want to talk about how human beings are designed. So 98% of the time, this is us, right? We're good listeners, we're good communicators, we're logical, we're intelligent, we're even kind of cute, right? But come a crucial conversation, we turn to this guy. We're left to deal with the most complex and challenging conversations of our lives with the same set of skills we'd use to deal with a salivating predator. And it's not our fault. If you think back over like evolutionary time frames, we weren't designed to have crucial conversations with our boss or with our spouse or an angry customer. We were designed to have crucial conversations with a saber-toothed cat. Right? So the cat appears on the scene, right? Adrenaline floods our body, blood rushes to our major muscle groups. What are we getting ready to do? Fight or flight. Notice how fight or flight sounds like violence and silence. We're building off that same model. And I want to share a little bit of detail about that model. How many of you have ever been to Glacier National Park? This is Mount Cannon. It's overlooking the lodge at Glacier National Park, and it's named Mount Cannon after a physician and his wife who summited it for the first time in recorded history, right, during their honeymoon. I want to introduce you to Dr. Cannon. His name's Walter Cannon. He was known throughout his life as a mountaineer who was the first on a lot of mountains in North America. He's also known as the guy who introduced the case study method to medical schools. He was the head of the Department of Internal Medicine at Harvard Medical School back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He found that the textbooks were incredibly boring. His students were drifting off. He didn't think that was a good idea. So he brought in his colleagues and even some of his patients to talk about the work they'd done that morning or the day before. And students stayed awake. Other faculty noticed that. And pretty soon Harvard formally adopted the case study method of teaching medicine. And they attribute it to this guy. Right? There's another thing he's known for. He's one of the very first physicians ever to bring this newfangled thing called X-rays into medical research. Prior to that, they didn't really particularly have a use for X-rays. Right? Now he would come in and he'd try to study the digestion system with X-rays. Now, does that strike anybody as strange? Any physicians in the group, you'd say, you know what? X-rays go right through your stomach. They don't see it. They go right through, like it's transparent. Right? So he invented what now we call the barium meal, so that it would make it all opaque so you could see it. Okay, so he's known for that. But what he's known for the most was what he did when World War I broke out. When World War I broke out, he decided he could serve the United States better by quitting his job at Harvard and going to Europe. He went to France, and he worked on the battlefield as a physician. And one of the first things he discovered is that more people die in battle due to shock than due to their wounds alone. That's still the case. Right? And at the time, there was no model to understand what shock really was. And he developed that model. When it comes to shock, here's what he said is going on. He said, your body's flooded with adrenaline, and blood rushes to your major muscle groups. That's a great thing if you're facing a saber-toothed cat. It's a horrible thing if you're gravely wounded, because you bleed out and you have a catastrophic loss of blood pressure and you die. And he coined a term for it. He called it the fight or flight syndrome. So we're building off his research. Now I want to update his research to today by introducing Amy Arnsten, the director of the Arnsten Lab at Yale Medical School. Now, anytime you have a lab at Yale Medical School named after you, you know you're doing something right, right? She's on everybody's short list for a Nobel Prize in medicine. Here's what she studies. She studies what adrenaline does to the brain. And here's what happens. You're in a stressful situation, and she describes stressful as no more stressful than being cut off on the freeway. Okay, one of her books is called, or one of her articles is called The Biology of Feeling Frazzled. Right? So it's this frazzled notion, right? Adrenaline, actually she'll call it epinephrine and norepinephrine, flood your brain, and it acts like a switch. It turns off your prefrontal cortex, that logical reasoning part, and it turns on the amygdala, which is the gateway to your lower brain, the part we share with reptiles, right? And when that happens, it's one of these good news, bad news kinds of things. The good news is when you're operating out of your lower brain, your reaction times are much quicker, right? And your hearing is enhanced. And your vision is actually more acute. This is all good stuff. The only downside is that your verbal skills drop to almost nothing, which is okay if you're facing a saber-toothed cat, right? But if you're facing like your boss, your spouse, we've all been there, right? This isn't a good thing, right? So the skills we're going to build today are how do we leverage out? How do we turn that switch the opposite way? So what we're going to do today is look at some skills and strategies for leveraging out of our more primitive reptilian brain back into our prefrontal cortex, where we can come up with logical, rational, and understanding-based solutions. And that's where we're headed next. Thanks.